Daymare 1994, a step in the right direction or a step back? Let's find out. Back in 2019, we as survival horror fans were extremely happy. Why? Because we finally got Resident Evil 2 Remake. And the game was magnificent, but here's the problem: there was one smaller indie survival horror experience that kind of went under the radar because of the release of Resident Evil 2 Remake, and that is Daymare 1998. This was an indie game that was pretty much a love letter to the original Resident Evil 2, as it shared a lot of similarities from that game. For example, the game primarily took place in a small town in the Northwest. It followed multiple protagonists and their stories as they battled through a city of zombies to achieve their own objectives. And while the game did have a lot of issues, especially when it came to some of the mechanics of the puzzles and stuff like that, it was obvious to see that the passion and love that the developers had for classic survival horror was present here. Thus, 4 years later, we finally get a sequel to that game. Well, technically. That is because the game actually takes place, ironically I might add, 4 years before the events of the first game. Daymare 1994 Sandcastle follows Reyes, a soldier for Hexacore's elite squad, Hades. Reyes and her team of 3 are sent to retrieve some vital information from a secret base that is, well, better known as Area 51. During this journey, Reyes unravels the secrets hidden deep within this base, battles some teleporting undead creatures, and even discovers some truth behind her own past. Now, as always, we're going to start with the most important part of any game, and that is the gameplay. If you've ever played the original game, which I recommend by the way, then you would probably be concerned about the gameplay coming into this game. Like I said earlier, you had some broken puzzles, a reloading mechanic that was obnoxious to use, and other features that just either didn't work or just didn't fit for the old school classic survival horror experience. However, with your experience with Daymare 1994, at least where the gameplay is concerned, things have been improved. No longer do you have to manually replace your magazines or individually reload each one, which in my opinion was the most annoying part of the original, but also that aiming in general is just overall much smoother and easier to use, which is extremely important considering that you're going up against faster enemies that also have the ability to teleport. Another concern with the original was that a lot of features were broken, more specifically some of the puzzles like I mentioned. Now I want to go ahead and focus on the puzzles for a moment because I do feel like all the puzzles work correctly and none of them are broken at all, unlike the original game. That being said, this time around the puzzles do feel fairly easy, and unfortunately it just isn't as creative as the original game in my opinion. I felt like a lot of puzzles this time around were pretty much environmental type puzzles that pretty much once you see it, you know it, you just gotta finish it. The most difficult puzzles in my opinion in this game was the hacking, and even then they weren't that difficult once you got the hang of it. But probably my favorite change in the gameplay is the introduction of the liquid nitrogen based weapon, the Frost Grip. This weapon has the ability to freeze enemies and allow you to get close enough to use a powerful finisher attack to put them down once and for all. I love creating different combination attacks with this ability along with my other weapons. Actually, the game offers an upgrade system this time around that allows you to enhance the frost grip and give it new abilities, such as leaving traps on the floor or even putting an ice shield up to deflect long range attacks. And it kind of adds to an overarching issue that I have with this game. This weapon is primarily more directed towards action horror or even a action shooter versus a survival horror experience. And with the game kind of marketing a survival horror experience, I was definitely going into it expecting one type of experience and kind of got another one. For example, the frost grip weapon, while awesome to use and stuff, I just felt like it created a more fast-paced experience, especially when you were battling against teleporting quick and fast enemies. Not to mention there were enemies that could one-hit kill you that teleported towards you, so it forced you to kind of like fight back immediately, versus whenever you compare it to like normal survival horror experiences, you can actually just be more strategic and think more about every single attack you do. Like if I had to compare this game to any game out there right now, I would probably compare it more heavily towards Dead Space. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different experience whenever you consider survival horror versus action horror. Now, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, and the reason why I kind of lean more towards this being an action shooter versus an actual action horror game even, is due to the fact of how you have to fight these enemies. In a game like Dead Space, normally you will be able to run past specific enemies if you're running low on ammunition or limited resources, or you can strategize based off of that. So it kind of adds survival horror aspects to an action horror game. Problem is with this game is that it feels more of an action shooter, kind of similar to a lower tame version of Doom, because in order to move forward you have to kill all the enemies in the area. You can't move to the next area until all the enemies are dead. And I feel like this takes a lot from the survival horror aspects. Now, like I keep saying, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you kind of like the whole Doom vibe, but make it a little bit more tame and combine it with kind of like the cosmetics of Dead Space, then I think you might really like this experience, as long as you don't picture a high budget like those experiences were. But I want to go ahead and add this, that I do believe Daymare 1994 did knock it out of the park when it came to the atmospheric horror, even more so than its predecessor did. With the jump scares, sound design, and terribly terrifying locations, I found myself getting spooked consistently by things as simple as a light flickering off and on or a spark from a breaker in the distance. And while the dark environment definitely helped in that regard, it also was a flaw as well, because a majority of the game you find yourself with limited visibility in the darkness. And that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, except for you find yourself in the darkness 90% of the entire game, and your flashlight maybe allows you to see 2 feet ahead of you. The problem I have with this is that unlike the original game, where you have some really unique set designs and some different areas of the city that made it look a little bit more interesting, this time around everything kind of looks exactly the same, and it gets really repetitive, stale, and boring. So for this reason, I wasn't a huge fan of them consistently throwing darkness into your face. I get the story side of things. You're inside a facility that is running low on power, so of course everything's going to be dark. But with everything pitch black, you don't really get to admire as much of the cosmetics of everything. And the one section that I felt like kind of stood out a little bit more, we were barely in, and it didn't really let us explore it as much. And that is a specific section within the facility that I can't really talk about without diving down into spoilers. If you know, you probably know it's the area that kind of resembles Daymare 1998, and I'll leave it at that. So the last thing I want to focus on is the story. Now, in my opinion, when it comes to Daymare 1994 and Daymare 1998, you're not really in it for the story. The story is not going to be the main selling factor when it comes to these games, because the stories are kind of over exaggerated, over the top, and the dialogue and the acting is subpar.
That's the green light from the DOD. Finally, we're good to go. It's code red.
It only took them 10 hours to figure it out. They must have pulled out all the stops. Let me guess. Are we leaving?
Damn straight. Get your ass off that chair. Foster's orders. It's effective immediately, and you do not want to keep him waiting.
I mean, think of the original Resident Evil trilogy. We all have nostalgia and we all love the original Resident Evil trilogy. But the fact is that, the story and the dialogue and the acting was not the best in those games. Let's be real. But what I will say is that I feel like the story was interesting enough to the point where it was better than the original game. In my opinion, the original game was kind of like all over the place, and it was hard to kind of follow exactly what was going on. This time it was one concise story that kind of included different elements going on and different subplots going on, but it definitely came to a conclusion that was somewhat satisfying. And something that helped with that is that the main protagonist is somewhat more interesting than any of the main protagonists that we got in Daymare 1998 in my opinion, and even the supporting cast is a little bit more interesting. Specifically, one character that I really like was Gora, and he is the leader of Section 8, and I won't dive too much into that storyline. So despite having some issues, this is still a fun experience. If you're looking for a classic survival horror game though, I will probably argue that this might not be for you. It does feature limited resources, puzzle solving, and inventory management, but it also forces you to kill every single monster you come across in the facility in a very action-paced, fast-paced experience. That involves a lot of running and gunning for the most part. However, if you just like a good horror experience with elements of third-person action shooter, kind of like a game combined with elements of Doom meets, say, Dead Space, then this might be the game for you actually. And honestly, I had a fun time with this game, and I definitely recommend it with the price tag of 35 American dollars. That's at least what I got for it. But let's put a number on it. My final verdict of the game comes from what I thought of it as a whole. Did I have fun with it, and how do I compare it to other games in the same genre? That being both survival horror and action horror, because I feel like it has elements of both. And with all of that in mind, I feel it's definitely at least above average and better than the original for sure. So based on that, I think I'm good with giving it a score of 6 out of 10. And honestly, that's a good score in my book, especially for an indie developer. I love that this game decided to kind of create its own identity, but at the same time drew in some inspiration from other experiences like Dead Space. Now, I do feel like that it did stray a little too far from its roots of what the original kind of set in motion, and it did leave me disappointed when it came to the puzzles and the repetitive settings and the lighting features, but overall it was still a fun experience that I recommend checking out for your first time. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, guys. Hit up the comments, let me know if you've already played this game, and if so, what would your score be? Like I said, it's a fun experience, and it's definitely an above average game. I waver between a 6 and a 7, but ultimately I just felt like it had enough flaws to kind of lower it just a tad bit to the 6-point level. But anyways, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and share this video with your friends and family. And as always, guys, I will see you on the next episode of Nerd Space. Take care.